In the world of the Northmen, where the clash of iron and the roar of war songs filled the sagas, there was another battle that was fought away from the battlefield, quieter, but no less perilous. This was the struggle of bringing life into the world. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors is a story rarely told in the grand halls or sung by the skalds. Yet it was a fight as fierce as any raid, and it claimed more lives than the sword ever did. For every warrior who charged into the fray, there was a woman who had once faced her own war in the dim glow of a hearth fire. Body torn by pain, breath stolen by the weight of fate. Childbirth in the Viking Age was not a matter of medicine, nor the watchful care of physicians. It was survival, raw and unguarded. The woman carried her child with the knowledge that she walked daily beside death. There were no doctors to ease her suffering, no surgeons to cut life free from her body. Instead, there was only the memory of those who had gone before her, the whispered wisdom of mothers and grandmothers, and the stern watch of the gods whose will could not be swayed. Where men bound themselves with oaths to kings, women bound themselves to life itself, wagering their bodies in a gamble that had no certainty of victory. The home became the battlefield. The longhouse, which by day rang with laughter, trade, and the smell of roasted meat, transformed into a chamber of blood and silence when the pangs began. The warrior's wife or the farmer's daughter alike would be laid upon furs, or set upon a birthing stool fashioned from sturdy wood, gripping ropes hung from beams above her head. The cries of pain filled the rafters like war horns, but there was no shield to block the agony, no armour to protect from the dangers that lurked, unseen bleeding that could not be stopped, fevers that consumed like wildfire, threads of life that could be severed at any moment. It was here that the unseen battle raged. For men, death came with the swing of an axe or the thrust of a spear, but for women, death could come with the breaking of waters. To bear a child was to put one's life into the hands of the Norns, the three weavers of fate who spun, measured, and cut the thread of every soul. A mother might pray to Frigg, goddess of hearth and motherhood, or to Freya, whose powers touched love and life alike. Charms were placed at the woman's side, Thor's hammer pendants pressed into her palm, carved runes laid upon her chest, as if divine strength could hold her spirit in place when her body threatened to give way. Around her, other women gathered, sisters, mothers, or the village midwife, the wise woman who had seen dozens of such struggles and carried in her mind the knowledge of herbs, the methods of easing pain, and the unspoken strength of endurance. There were no written scrolls, no instruments of steel, only hands and voices. They whispered words meant to steady the spirit, brewed teas of meadowsweet or yarrow to calm the storms within her, and tied cords for the mother to grip when the force of labour came upon her, like waves against a ship's hull. Every trick of survival was born not of science but of memory, passed from one woman to the next like an heirloom of flesh and blood. Yet even with charms and herbs, even with the firm hand of a midwife at her side, the battle could not always be won. It was common enough for men to leave their homes on a raid and never return, but just as many women perished upon their furs, their screams fading into silence as the fire crackled low. Stillborn children, lifeless mothers, these were not tales woven into the glory of sagas, but they lingered in every family, haunting the quiet corners of memory. In those moments, the people of the North turned to the gods, believing that death in childbirth was not shame, but sacrifice, a toll paid to the weavers of fate to ensure that the line of the clan continued. And when the battle was won, when the first cry of a newborn cut through the smoke-filled air, it was as if victory had been seized from death itself. The child's cry was the war horn of triumph, a signal that life had endured against all odds. The mother, sweat-soaked and trembling, had become more than just the giver of life. She was a survivor of the greatest peril her world demanded of her. The newborn was pressed to her chest, the firelight dancing across their faces, while the other women gave thanks in whispers to gods and ancestors alike. So, in a land where axes carved out kingdoms and longships carved paths across seas, another kind of courage was demanded behind the walls of every longhouse. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors is not a tale of weakness, but of strength beyond imagining. These women carried the lifeblood of their people, fought their unseen battles, and endured pains that even warriors could not fathom. Their victories were not sung in mead halls, but they were etched into every generation that followed, for every warrior who raised his sword owed his first breath to the quiet triumph of a woman who had walked through the shadow of death and returned with life in her arms. In the age of sagas, when men carved their legends with steel and fire, there were others whose battles were quieter but no less vital. These were the women who stood at the threshold of life and death, guiding mothers through the storm of childbirth with nothing but their hands, their voices, and the weight of tradition. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors can never be told without speaking of the midwives of the North, those wise women whose skill and courage determined whether bloodlines endured or were broken by the cruel hand of fate. The midwife was no warrior in the way men knew the word, but her power was unquestioned. She bore no axe, no shield, but she carried knowledge older than any saga, wisdom passed down through generations like sacred treasure. Every herb she plucked, every rune she whispered, every command she gave in the dim firelight carried the weight of countless births before. In her presence, even the mightiest jarls and raiders lowered their voices, for they knew that without her, no son would be born to inherit their hall, no daughter to weave their legacy into the years to come. When the first pangs gripped a woman, the call went out for the midwife. She arrived not with pomp, but with purpose, moving through the longhouse like a shadow of authority. Her hands were rough from work, her hair streaked with the silver of experience, but her gaze was sharp, steady, and unyielding. In her pouch rattled dried herbs, angelica root to steady the womb, juniper berries to ward off evil, yarrow to staunch bleeding should the worst come. Around her neck hung charms, Thor's hammer, a carved piece of amber, perhaps a small rune etched upon bone protection not just for the mother, but for herself, for she too walked perilously close to death each time she entered that birthing room. Her role was part healer, part sorceress, part anchor in the storm. She knew how to mix meadowsweet with water to dull pain, how to burn herbs upon the hearth so their smoke would drive away malevolent spirits, how to murmur prayers to Frigg, the goddess of motherhood, or to call upon Freya, whose powers touched love, fertility, and battle alike. For every birth was a battle, and the midwife was both general and shield maiden, commanding the women who assisted, keeping the mother tethered to life when the tide threatened to sweep her away. No man entered this space, for the birthing chamber was hallowed ground of women, and men were as helpless there as babes themselves. The midwife set the rhythm. She ordered furs laid, ropes hung for gripping, birthing stools prepared if needed. She pressed her palm to the mother's sweat-slicked brow, steadying her, whispering strength into her ear. Her hands, though calloused, moved with certainty, massaging the belly, adjusting the child's position with unseen skill, coaxing life with the touch of one who had done this many times before. Yet her art was more than physical. She carried with her a weight of superstition and belief, for in the Viking age, no birth was without danger from both flesh and spirit. The midwife knew the runes to carve upon small pieces of wood, the chance to keep trolls or vengeful spirits from snatching the child before it took its first breath. She might tie a red thread around the mother's wrist to confuse wandering spirits, or place an iron knife beneath the bed to drive away ill luck. These rituals were not mere ceremony, they were shields against the unseen, for when medicine failed, only faith and tradition remained. Her authority was absolute. When she raised her hand, silence fell, even in the midst of screams. When she barked commands, they were obeyed without question. She was the guardian at the crossroads of life, and all knew that her judgment was the only barrier between survival and despair. If she declared the birth to be hard, hearts sank. If she whispered that the child came strong, relief swept the room like fresh wind after storm. The fate of families, of clans, often rested in her weathered hands, but for all her knowledge, the midwife was not invincible. She had wrapped lifeless babes in cloth and buried them quietly beneath the earth, her heart heavy with grief she could never fully speak aloud. These failures, too, she carried with her, etched into her bones as reminders of the thin line she walked each time she answered the call. Yet even with sorrow, she endured, for to refuse her duty was unthinkable. Without her, the people of the North would wither. With her, they stood a chance to grow and thrive. In the sagas, men are remembered for victories won with steel, but the midwives of the North fought their own wars in firelit rooms, against odds as ruthless as any battlefield. They wove together faith, skill, and raw willpower, becoming lifelines where none should have existed. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was not by chance. It was because women like these stood unshaken when death prowled closest, holding the line until the first cry of a newborn declared victory. When the time of birth drew near, the longhouse, normally a place of feasting, trade, and daily toil, was transformed into something altogether different. Its timbered walls, darkened by smoke and years of fire, became the backdrop for a struggle as fierce as any clash of swords. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors is inseparable from the spaces in which they laboured. Became the only shield between life and the waiting jaws of death. The birthing chamber was no battlefield in the open sun. It was enclosed, shadowed, heavy with heat, and the thick scent of wood smoke, sweat, and burning herbs. Often a smaller side room of the longhouse was chosen, or at times a hut set apart from the din of daily life. Privacy was more than courtesy, it was protection. To give birth in the open hall was unthinkable. The act was sacred and dangerous, and the walls themselves were believed to guard the mother, keeping away hostile spirits that prowled for weakness. Inside, the fire was stoked high. Flames licked at logs until the chamber sweltered, for warmth was thought to ward off illness and soothe the mother's labour. Shadows danced across carved beams and woven tapestries, casting shapes that seemed to shift with every cry and gasp. They spread soft furs upon the ground or arranged benches and stools, ensuring the mother had strength beneath her. Above, ropes were tied to beams, thick cords for her to grasp when the waves of pain dragged her body to its limits. The birthing hut, or the chosen room within the hall, was more than just wood and thatch, it was sanctified ground. Protective objects were carefully placed to guard mother and child. An iron knife might be laid beneath the bed, not for use but as a weapon against spirits who sought to steal breath before it could fill the newborn's lungs. Carved runes on pieces of wood or bone were set nearby, inscribed with blessings of strength, safe passage, and life. Thor's hammer pendants gleamed faintly in the firelight, called upon not for war but for protection against unseen enemies. Every object was a ward, every placement deliberate, as though the very room was being woven into a shield of faith. The midwife directed these preparations with unyielding certainty. She knew which charms belonged where, which herbs should be hung in bundles to perfume the air. Juniper was burned in the fire to cleanse and drive away ill fortune, its acrid smoke mingling with the musk of sweat. Sometimes the walls themselves were anointed with mixtures of fat and herbs, smearing protection into the very grain of the timber. To the unknowing eye, it might have seemed superstition, but for those who lived beneath the threat of death in childbirth, these rituals were as vital as the fire's heat. When the mother was brought into the chamber, it was as if she stepped into another world. Outside, men sharpened blades, tended animals, or prepared for journeys. But inside, all eyes turned to her. She was not merely a woman now. She was the vessel carrying her clan's future. The room pressed close with expectation and dread, the air heavy with prayers unspoken. Every groan, every tightening of her grip on the rope was answered with murmured encouragement or the rustle of hands preparing herbs and water. In that chamber, the ordinary hut was transformed into a sanctuary of survival. The fire, the charms, the gathered women, all stood between the mother and the abyss. No doctors would come, no skilled surgeons, no instruments forged for cutting life free from the grasp of death. There was only tradition, the accumulated wisdom of generations, and the sanctity of the space itself. And yet, for all its warmth and ritual, the birthing room was still a place of danger. The screams of women who had not survived still echoed in memory, haunting the walls like ghosts. Families remembered the mothers who had entered those sacred spaces and never emerged. Their bodies carried out to burial while their infants cried weakly in the arms of kin, or worse, lay silent as well. The hut could shield and sanctify, but it could not defy the will of the Norns. The women knew this. Still, they clung to their rituals, for to do nothing was to invite despair, and to prepare the space was to seize whatever measure of control fate allowed. When the child's first cry broke through the room, it was more than the voice of a newborn. It was the song of victory, proof that the chamber had held, that life had triumphed. The walls, the fire, the charms, all had done their work, becoming not just a shelter but a womb for both mother and child. The birthing hut, with its shadows and its sanctity, had served its purpose once again, delivering not only life but hope to those who gathered there. Thus, the ordinary huts and private rooms of the Vikings became the unseen fortresses where the most crucial battles of survival were fought. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was not merely a question of pain and endurance, but of creating sacred spaces that turned fragile walls into guardians, protecting life where it was most vulnerable. For within those smoky, fire-lit chambers, the future of the North was born one cry, one breath, one blood-soaked victory at a time. No battle in the Viking world was more unpredictable than childbirth. A sword might break, a A shield might splinter, but a warrior knew his odds. A mother in labour did not. She entered the ordeal with no weapon but her own strength, and no armour but the prayers spoken over her. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was not only a matter of midwives and hearthfires, but of charms against death itself. Every birth was stalked by the shadow of mortality, and so the Northmen wrapped their women in layers of faith, superstition, and whispered appeals to the gods. It was said that the Norns, the weavers of fate, sat at the roots of Yggdrasil, carving each life's destiny into the fibres of the cosmos. A woman in labour lay beneath their watchful eyes, uncertain whether her thread would be allowed to continue or be cut short. And so, before the pangs became unbearable, before sweat drenched her skin and her cries shook the rafters, the midwife and her kin fortified the space with sacred protections. The walls, the hearth, the very air was turned into a shield of spirit to guard mother and child. Amulets were the first line of defence. Around the labouring woman's neck might rest Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, its small iron or silver weight pressed against her skin. The hammer was not only the symbol of thunder and strength, but a talisman of protection, believed to shatter the unseen claws of spirits that prowl during childbirth. Some families tied amber beads into the woman's hair or laid them on her chest, their golden glow thought to ward off sickness and lend courage. Iron itself, harsh and unyielding, was placed beneath the bed or near the doorway, for spirits shrank from its cold bite. Runes were carved and whispered over. Pieces of wood or bone, etched with symbols of life, protection and endurance, were laid within reach of the midwife. The rune algiz, shaped like the antlers of an elk, stood as a shield against danger. The rune Bacano, the birch tree, symbolised birth and new beginnings, and was often drawn upon the woman's wrist or belly with soot or blood. These marks were not merely lines, but living prayers, carved into the weave of fate in hopes of swaying it. The midwife might trace them gently upon the mother's skin, murmuring chants so old their words were half forgotten, but their power still feared. The air itself was thick with ritual. Juniper branches were burned, their smoke curling upward like the breath of sacrifice, believed to cleanse the chamber and blind spirits that lingered. Bundles of herbs, meadowsweet, angelica and mugwort were tied and hung over beams, their scent sharp and earthy. Some women clutched sprigs of these plants in their fists, gripping them like weapons as pain racked their bodies, as if nature itself could be a companion in the fight. And then came the prayers. Frigg, the goddess of motherhood, was called upon first. Women whispered her name with urgency, pleading that she grant mercy, that she untangle the knots of pain and guide both mother and child safely through. Freya, too, was invoked goddess of love, of fertility, of battle. She knew what it meant to endure blood and suffering, and mothers begged her to lend her strength, to turn screams into the cry of new life. These gods, fierce and nurturing alike, were not distant figures in gilded temples. They were believed to be near, hovering in the firelight, weighing every breath, every drop of blood, every plea. The midwife herself often took on the role of priestess, muttering spells half under her breath as she pressed warm cloths to the mother's body. Some chants were little more than strings of words, repeated to weave rhythm into chaos. Others were sharper, commands directed at spirits, ordering them to flee. Begone from this hall, begone from this womb. Life is claimed, death has no hold here. These words, rough in the old tongue, were thrust like spears against the unseen, meant to create a circle of protection in which only life could enter. Yet for all the amulets, all the runes, all the charms tied and placed, the terror remained. Women had seen others die despite every spell. They knew the charms were fragile barriers against a power that often could not be swayed. But still they clung to them. To enter labour without such defences was unthinkable. It was to face battle naked, unarmed, unshielded. Even if fate could not be defied, one had to try. One had to fight with every tool of spirit and faith handed down through the ages. When the final moment came, when the child slipped into the world with a cry or lay silent in the midwife's hands, the power of the charms was measured in triumph or tragedy. If mother and child lived, the runes were kissed, the amulets polished and passed down, the herbs cast into the fire in gratitude. If death had come, the charms were not cursed, but mourned, as if they too had fought and fallen. For in the Viking mind, nothing was certain but the will of the Norns. Still, the rituals endured. Generations of women whispered the same spells, tied the same charms, carved the same runes, because to abandon them was to surrender. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was not with hopelessness, but with a desperate kind of defiance, an insistence that even against the shadow of death, they would fight with every breath, every word, every sacred object they possessed. And sometimes, against all odds, it was enough. In the north, where storms howled against the halls and winters gnawed at the bones, the greatest storm a woman might face was not the weather, but the agony of childbirth. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was as much about enduring pain as it was about surviving it, and here the ancient knowledge of herbs and brews stood as their only shield. No man of healing came with iron tools or knowledge of the body. Instead, women turned to the earth itself, pulling from soil and forest the roots, leaves and berries that carried whispers of relief. Mixed with faith and fear, these remedies became weapons against agony, bleeding, and the terror that could shatter the will of even the strongest mother. The air inside the birthing room was heavy with smoke and steam. Juniper branches crackled in the fire, their sharp scent filling lungs with each breath. The smoke was said to drive away evil spirits, but it carried another purpose too. It cleansed the air, masking the iron tang of blood, the sweat that poured from the mother's body, the stench of fear that thickened as labour dragged on. Every inhalation of juniper was both prayer and medicine, meant to clear the path for life and bar the way for death. When the pains came like crashing waves, relentless and merciless, the midwife reached for her pouch. There she kept meadowsweet, the white-flowered plant whose leaves could be brewed into a bitter tea. The drink dulled the edges of pain, offering the mother brief moments where her cries softened, where her body could gather strength for the next assault. Angelica root was sometimes added, ground and steeped, until the bitter liquid seemed almost to burn the tongue, but it carried with it the power to steady the womb, to bring order to the chaos inside. Mugwort, the herb of dreams and visions, was placed beneath pillows or burned in small bundles. Its smoke curled through the chamber like pale fingers, believed to soothe the mind and calm the trembling spirit. A mother gripped the rope above her head, sweat dripping into her eyes, and as the mugwort smoke touched her, she found strength to ride out another scream. Fear was as deadly as blood loss, and so the midwives fought it not only with words but with herbs that carried both scent and superstition. There were brews made for courage as well as for pain. Honeyed drinks mixed with valerian or chamomile were pressed to the lips of the mother, sweet enough to coax her to swallow even when her jaw clenched tight against agony. The warmth spread through her chest, loosening the grip of fear, allowing her to breathe deep and face the next surge. These drinks were not always gentle, sometimes strong ale itself was given, thick and heavy, blurring the senses until the line between pain and haze grew thin. Better to be dulled, better to stumble through the storm half dreaming, than to face every moment with eyes wide and mind sharp. But herbs were not only for calming. Some were weapons against death itself. Yarrow, with its feathery leaves, was pressed into wounds or brewed into teas to staunch bleeding when blood poured like water and threatened to carry the mother away. The midwife's hands, firm and unyielding, packed it against the torn flesh, whispering prayers as if to bind spirit and body together with the plant's strength. Shepherd's purse, too, was prized, its small, heart-shaped leaves crushed and applied to slow the flow of blood. In those moments, with a woman's life slipping like sand through an open hand, these plants stood between life and the grave. Every herb carried meaning beyond its use. Meadowsweet was not merely for pain, it was said to please the gods with its sweet fragrance. Angelica was sacred, tied to protection, believed to ward off sickness as well as calm the womb. Juniper's sharp smoke was not just medicine, but a spear against lurking spirits. To the Vikings, the line between healing and magic did not exist. Every sip, every poultice, every wisp of smoke was both remedy and ritual, binding body and spirit together. The midwives wielded this knowledge like warriors wielded blades. Their pouches rattled with dried leaves and roots, their fingers stained with the green and brown of plants ground between stone. They knew which brew to give when the mother's cries grew faint, which smoke to burn when her eyes glazed with fear. They carried the wisdom of countless births within them, lessons written not in ink but in survival. A woman lived, and the herb was remembered. A woman died, and the herb was blamed, altered, or abandoned. Each birth reshaped the midwife's knowledge, carving her into both healer and sorceress. Still, no herb could promise safety. Many mothers died despite the strongest brews, the sharpest smelling smokes, the bitterest teas forced down trembling throats. Pain often lingered unbroken, bleeding often came unstoppable, and the midwife could do nothing but watch as life slipped away. Yet the herbs were never forsaken, for they were the only tools women had. To give birth without them would be to stand unarmed against an enemy no one could see. And so, in the fire-lit chambers of the north, where cries of labour echoed against timbered walls, herbs and brews became the closest thing to mercy. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was through this delicate weaving of earth's gifts and human endurance, where bitter teas and acrid smokes mixed with whispered spells. Pain was dulled, blood was stanched. Fear was soothed, not always enough to save, but often enough to endure. In the heart of agony, when death waited just beyond the threshold, these humble plants became lifelines, fragile yet fierce, holding back the darkness with their scent, their taste, their promise. In the long houses of the north, where smoke curled against rafters and the crackle of fire was constant, there came a moment when even the bravest women were brought to their knees. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was not only a matter of herbs and charms, but of sheer strength their own and that of the women who stood beside them. No one could escape the raw storm of labour. It descended with crushing weight, wave after wave, tearing the body as surely as an enemy's blade. Yet these women faced it with hands gripping rope, thighs trembling upon birthing stools, and the steady guidance of midwives whose touch could mean the difference between despair and endurance. The body itself became a battlefield. Muscles pulled taut, sweat ran in rivers, and breath came in gasps like a warrior caught in his last stand. There was no place to hide, no way to flee the searing pain that split the hours into an eternity of struggle. Women laboured in positions designed not for comfort, but for survival. Some were lowered onto birthing stools, sturdy seats with an open space carved in the centre, allowing the child's passage downward. Others squatted low, feet planted on the packed earth, their backs braced against the knees or arms of kinswomen, letting gravity drag life into the world. These postures were harsh, demanding, but they were the way of necessity, forged from generations of trial and memory. Above, from the heavy beams of the longhouse, ropes were knotted and hung. They swayed like the rigging of a ship, ready for desperate hands. The mother clutched them with fingers slick from sweat, knuckles whitening as she pulled with all her might during each contraction. The rope became her anchor, something to fight against as her body tore itself apart and rebuilt in the same breath. Some women screamed into those ropes, biting them, straining them with such force that fibres frayed and twisted. To grasp the rope was to grasp at life itself. Clinging until strength was spent, then summoning it again from some well hidden deep within. The midwife was ever close, her hands unyielding yet gentle, guiding, pressing, pulling when the moment demanded it. She massaged the belly in firm circles, coaxing the child lower. She braced the mother's shoulders when her strength faltered, lending her body as a pillar when the woman thought she might collapse. When the child's head crowned, slick with blood and fluid, the midwife's fingers were there firm, precise, practiced easing, stretching, ensuring that life did not tear too quickly into the world and drag its vessel into ruin. Every movement of her hands was honed by countless births before, a knowledge not spoken but carried in muscle and memory. Around them, the women of the family lent their strength as well. A sister gripped the mother's hand, whispering encouragement through her teeth. A mother wiped sweat from her daughter's brow with a rough cloth dipped in warm water. Some pressed their own bodies against hers, forming walls of flesh and bone to hold her steady as she strained and shook. The air was filled with cries, not just the sharp agony of the mother, but the low chants of those around her, voices that carried rhythm through the chaos. In those moments, pain was not hers alone, but shared, as if the strength of many could carry one through the fire. Yet nothing could soften the truth. The agony was relentless. Contractions seized the body like iron bands, twisting and grinding until the woman shook with exhaustion. Veins bulged in her neck, her face flushed with blood as she bore down again and again, pushing with every last shred of strength. Some women fainted, only to be roused with sharp cries or cold cloths pressed against their temples. Others vomited from the sheer force of their body's struggle. Yet even then, they were urged back into the battle, for there was no pause, no surrender, no retreat. And still, the strength required was not only of flesh but of spirit. Each scream was matched with the will to go on, even when eyes rolled back and limbs trembled with weakness. Women endured because they must, because their child's first cry was worth more than any relief. Pain was not simply endured, it was fought, mastered, turned into the fuel that brought life through blood and fire. In Viking lands, where courage was carved into men with steel, it was here in these hidden chambers that the fiercest strength of all was tested. When at last the moment broke, when the final push brought forth the child, the rope fell slack, the stool groaned empty, and the cries of the mother gave way to the first cries of her newborn. The air shifted, still heavy, still thick with sweat and blood, but pierced now with triumph. The midwife lifted the child, slippery and red, into the arms of the mother whose strength had carried her through the storm. In that instant, the agony that had seemed endless dissolved into something almost holy. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was through hands, rope, and strength, nothing more, nothing less. With ropes that bore the weight of agony, with stools that steadied trembling bodies, with midwives whose hands carved the line between life and death, and with women whose will could outlast pain itself. These were the battles fought in silence, unmarked by sagas, yet more terrible and more glorious than any fought upon a field. For no sword could match the strength of a woman who, torn and weary, still rose to bring life into the world. In the world of the North, death walked hand in hand with life, never more closely than in the birthing chamber. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was not only a story of strength, herbs, and ritual. It was also a story haunted by the constant shadow of death. For every cry of a newborn that pierced the smoke and silence, there were silences more terrible still. To bring forth life was to gamble one's own, and no woman entered that struggle without knowing it. Childbirth claimed more Viking women than war ever claimed their men, and it was spoken of in whispers, for it was a battlefield hidden behind wooden walls. The dangers were many, and they struck without mercy. Fever was the unseen fire, a sickness that crept in after the child had come, searing the mother with heat until her body weakened and her breath faltered. No charm could cool its fury, no herb could always tame it. A woman might smile weakly as she held her newborn, only to wither in the days that followed, her skin damp and pale, her strength draining away like water spilled upon the earth. Families prayed, midwives tried every brew and smoke they knew, but often the fever proved relentless, dragging mothers into the grave long after the battle seemed won. Bleeding was a swifter terror. Once begun, it poured out with the force of a river, staining furs and pooling on the packed earth. The midwife pressed yarrow and shepherd's purse against the wound, whispered to the gods, called for every hand to press and hold, but still the life flowed out. The mother's face turned ashen, her lips blue, her voice fading into whispers too soft to hear. Death came quickly then, the child wailing in one corner, while the mother slipped into silence in another. Men knew what it was to bleed out on the battlefield, but women knew it in their homes, their blood soaking into hearthstones as surely as any warriors did into foreign soil. Stillbirth was perhaps the cruelest of all. A woman endured the hours of torment, her body racked with pain, her spirit stretched to its limits, only for silence to greet her at the end. The midwife lifted a child that did not cry, its small form limp and cold, its breath never taken. Sometimes the mother herself did not survive the labour that killed her child, and the two were laid together in the earth, their bodies bound by tragedy. At other times the child was lost and the mother lived, but her heart was shattered, for she had walked through agony only to emerge with empty arms. Such grief was heavier than any chain, heavier than any axe, and it lingered in the air of the longhouse long after the herbs were burned away. Every family in the north carried such stories. They were not told in the mead hall, not sung by the skalds, but they lived in the silence of women's eyes, in the empty spaces where mothers or infants should have been. Men remembered fallen brothers on raids, but women remembered sisters, daughters, mothers who had fallen in childbirth. The statistics of death in battle were sung proudly, yet it was whispered among the women that more of their kind had perished, bringing life into the world than men had ever lost with sword in hand. The Vikings did not see these deaths as weakness. They understood them as sacrifice, no less honourable than the warrior's fall. The Norns, those three who spun, measured, and cut the threads of fate, were said to hold the shears close when a woman entered labour. No one knew whose thread would be severed. No one knew whether the gods would demand a price. Some women spoke openly before their time came, handing trinkets or words of love to their kin, as though already preparing for the chance they would not walk away from the firelit room. Others prayed in silence, clutching amulets in their fists, knowing well that no plea could sway the inevitable should fate decide against them. The shadow of death gave childbirth its dread, but it also gave it its sacredness. To endure labour was to prove courage greater than most men would ever know. To survive, it was to step back from the very edge of hell's domain, carrying life in trembling arms. And when women fell, their sacrifice was honoured, even if quietly, even if only among the kin who buried them. For without their gamble, without their struggle, the line of the clan would end, and no saga would ever be sung. Thus, every cry of a newborn in Viking lands was not just the sound of new life, it was the sound of victory snatched from the jaws of death. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was always a story of chance, a wager made in blood and pain. And though the shadow of death never left their side, it was their courage in the face of it that gave the North its future, and the sagas their heroes. There was no grief more cutting, no silence more terrible, than when a newborn did not draw breath. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was already a gamble with death, but when the struggle ended not in a child's cry but in stillness, the weight of sorrow fell upon the hall like a cloak of iron. The Norns, it was said, had cut the thread too soon, measuring the child's life not in years but in heartbeats. And in those moments, when the gods took the child, the family turned from battle and herbs to ritual and mourning, seeking meaning in loss that could never truly be softened. The body of the infant was treated with reverence, no matter how brief its life had been. Midwives, whose hands had moments before strained to pull the child into the world, now wrapped it in cloth, careful and deliberate, as though cradling a treasure too delicate to touch the air. The mother, broken from her ordeal and heavy with grief, might reach with trembling arms to hold her child, if only for a moment, to see its face and memorize the curve of its features before the earth claimed it. That final embrace was both torment and blessing. For though it deepened the wound of loss, it also gave the mother proof that her child had existed, even if only between the darkness and the dawn. Whispers filled the chamber. Women murmured prayers to Frigg, to Freya, to all the goddesses who watched over birth and death, begging them to carry the child safely into the next world. Some would press Thor's hammer gently against the child's chest, not to protect its life but to shield its soul in the journey beyond. A bowl of water was sometimes sprinkled over the body, a ritual echo of the naming ceremonies given to the living. Though the child would never bear a name among mortals, it was given to the gods with dignity, as if to say, "This life was small, but it was sacred." The burial came quickly, for such tiny bodies could not linger. Outside the longhouse, a small grave was dug, often near the family's land, where the child could rest among kin. There was no great mound, no standing stone, no saga carved in runes, only a shallow pit lined with furs, sometimes with a bead of amber, a tiny hammer pendant, or a scrap of cloth laid beside the child as a token of love. The earth closed over quietly, with no feasting, no revelry. Only sorrow and silence marked the moment, broken by the low voices of kin giving final prayers. Some believed these little ones went straight to Frigg's Hall, a place where lost children were gathered and cared for by the goddess of mothers. Others thought the souls were taken to hell, not in punishment but as part of the natural order, their lives threads too fragile to endure the weaving. For the mother, the grief was a wound deeper than the tearing of childbirth. She had suffered the full storm, her body broken and bloodied in the effort to bring forth life, only to be given emptiness in return. Often she mourned in silence, her sorrow too great to voice, for in a world where death was constant, grief had little space to linger. Yet those around her knew the depth of her loss. Sisters, mothers and midwives carried her through the first days, bringing herbs to heal her body, though nothing could ease the ache within. The family honoured the child not with sagas or stones, but with memory. A lock of hair might be kept, a bead strung upon a cord, a mark carved into a timber post within the hall. In this way, the child was not forgotten, even if no songs were sung. Death had come too soon, but remembrance ensured the thread, though cut, was not erased. And so the little graves, scattered near farms and villages, became silent testaments to how many battles had been fought and lost before life could take hold. To the Vikings, loss was part of the rhythm of existence. Crops failed, winters killed, raiders burned, and death was never far. Yet when the gods took the child, the sorrow was set apart, more piercing than famine, sharper than the sword. For a mother's blood had been spilled, her body torn, her spirit tested, and still fate had denied her. In those moments the people of the north bowed their heads to the will of the Norns, knowing that no charm, no herb, no strength could have altered what was written beneath the roots of Yggdrasil. And yet, life endured. Women who lost children would face the ordeal again, because they must. The clan's survival depended on it, and courage demanded it. The mourning lingered, etched in the heart, but so too did the knowledge that each birth, whether triumphant or tragic, was part of the great weave. Some threads ended before they began, others stretched across generations, but all were bound to the same loom, where the gods chose when to cut. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was never free of peril. And when the gods took the child, grief filled the halls, graves filled the earth, and memory filled the hearts of those left behind. In those small mounds, in those whispered prayers, in those tokens buried with tiny hands, lay the reminder that life in the north was always balanced on a blade's edge, and that even the smallest thread could shape the fate of a family forever. The moment the cry broke through the hall, sharp and raw, it was as though the world itself shifted. After hours, sometimes days of agony, blood, and breathless prayers, the first sound of a child's voice cut through the smoke and shadows like a horn on the battlefield. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was never a tale of ease or certainty, but when the newborn's wail rang out, it was a victory greater than gold. That fragile cry was proof that life had taken hold, that the mother's ordeal had not been in vain. The first breath of a warrior had been drawn, and with it came honour, hope, and the binding of new threads to the fate of the clan. The child, slippery with blood and glistening in the firelight, was lifted by the midwife and laid upon the mother's chest. Her body, trembling and drained, curled around it instinctively, her breath ragged yet filled with fierce relief. For a moment, the world was only the two of them. The woman who had walked through the valley of death and the child whose cry had pulled her back into life. Around them, the other women exhaled as though they had been holding their breath for hours, and the fire seemed to burn brighter, its warmth no longer a shield but a celebration. But in the Viking world, survival was never left unmarked. The newborn's arrival was not complete until ritual gave it place and meaning. A bowl of water was brought forth, often sprinkled with herbs or blessed by words whispered to the gods. The child was lifted gently, and water was sprinkled over its head, a rite not unlike baptism in distant lands, though here it was not of Christian faith but of deep tradition. This sprinkling was called vatni ausa, to be sprinkled with water, and it marked the child's acceptance into the living. Without it, a child was not fully part of the clan. With it, the newborn was claimed, protected, and woven into the tapestry of kin and community. The naming came soon after. Names were not chosen lightly. They carried the weight of ancestors, the honour of warriors long gone, or the hope of virtues to come. A boy might be named after a grandfather who had fallen in battle, as if the thread of his spirit now continued in the tiny fists that clenched at the air. A girl might bear the name of a grandmother who had kept a farm through winters of famine, her strength reborn in a new form. Sometimes names carried omens or were chosen to invoke protection, binding the child to gods or heroes. To name was to claim, and to claim was to honour. Once named, the child was carried into the hall. Fires still burned, the smell of herbs and blood lingered, but now voices lifted in relief and celebration. The newborn was presented to the family, and in wealthier households, to the gathered community. Small gifts were sometimes placed at its side, an iron knife, a bead of amber, or even a tiny hammer of Thor to bind the child's life to fortune and protection. For the clan, this was not just a moment of joy but of survival, for every new life meant strength against famine, war, and the long winters that tested them all. Yet beneath the celebration was always the knowledge of what had been risked. The mother, pale and weak, was praised for her courage, for she had faced a foe deadlier than steel and returned victorious. Women murmured words of admiration, men bowed their heads in respect, for they knew that without her endurance no feast, no raid, no saga could continue. Her survival was as honoured as the child's first breath, and together they symbolised the unbroken thread of the clan's future. There were darker customs too, though spoken of rarely and with caution. In times of famine or hardship, when survival itself teetered on the edge, unwanted or weak children were sometimes left to the elements, exposed to die as fate decreed. Yet when a child was accepted, when water touched its brow, and a name was given, such thoughts vanished. That child was now clan, bound by honour, destined to stand among its people. Its first breath was no longer fragile, but a pledge, a promise to grow into one who would fight, farm, or bear children of their own. So the first cry of a newborn was more than a sound, it was a proclamation. It told the hall that the mother had endured, that the child had survived, that the gods had granted another life to the people of the north. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors was a tale drenched in blood, soothed with herbs, guarded by charms, but it was crowned by this moment, the first breath of a warrior, no matter how small. For in that cry lay the strength of generations, the continuation of stories yet unwritten, and the honour of survival carved into the heart of the clan. In the lands of the north, where longships carved paths across the seas and warriors carved sagas into the memory of their people, it was easy to believe that strength was measured only by the clash of steel and the conquest of kingdoms. Yet beneath every saga hero, beneath every warrior who raised his sword in glory, there lay another story quieter, but more enduring. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors is not simply the tale of pain and survival within the shadows of the hearth. It is the foundation of the north itself, for without them, no raid would have set sail, no hall would have echoed with laughter, no bloodline would have endured the centuries. These women were the true life-givers. Their bodies the vessels through which the future was forged. They bore the agony of labour without the promise of healing hands or learned physicians, facing death with each birth as though it were a rival seated at their bedside. They endured not once, but often many times in their short lives, giving child after child to the clan, each one a gamble that might cost them their own. Their blood soaked the furs, their cries filled the rafters, and their will alone pulled the thread of their people forward. That was their legacy, not a single act of bravery, but countless acts, repeated in firelit chambers across the north for generations. The warriors sung of in the Skald's verses, the kings, jarls, and shield-bearers whose names echoed across fjord and field, were only possible because their mothers had once survived this most brutal of ordeals. For every axe swung there had been a cry of birth, for every shield lifted there had been a mother's hand gripping rope and wood, forcing life into the world through pain greater than any blade could inflict. The sagas told of men who faced death on the battlefield, but the truth known among the women was this. More had died in childbirth than in war. Their sacrifice was quieter, but no less noble, for it ensured that the clan did not vanish into the cold silence of winter. They did not fight for gold or plunder, nor for the boasting rights of mead halls. They fought for something simpler, and perhaps greater the survival of kin, the continuation of bloodlines, the chance for children to see another sunrise. They fought with their bodies, with herbs and charms, with the steady hands of midwives and the strength of their own will. Their battles were not sung, but they were remembered in the faces of sons and daughters who lived to carry the clan's name. And what of the gods? The Vikings believed that fate was woven by the Norns, that no man or woman could escape the thread allotted to them. Yet each birth was an act of defiance, a challenge hurled at the weavers themselves. Every child born alive was proof that human courage could seize victory from the hands of death, if only for a moment. Mothers who endured became honoured not only in their households but in the unspoken reverence of their kin, for they had walked closer to death than any raider, and returned carrying life. The legacy of these life-givers lies not in stone monuments or towering ruins, but in the blood that flowed forward. Every strong arm that hauled an oar, every keen eye that watched the horizon for sails, every voice that carried a saga into the future existed because a woman had survived the fires of childbirth. Without them, the world of the Vikings would have ended not with conquest, but with silence. Their courage, their resilience, their sacrifice. These were the true foundations of the North, stronger than iron, deeper than the sea. So, when we think of the Viking Age, of longships gliding over dark waters and warriors shouting beneath banners, we must remember the truth hidden in the shadows of the Longhouse. It was not only men with axes who built that world, but women who bore children with nothing but herbs, charms, and unyielding will. How Viking mothers gave birth without doctors is not only a tale of survival, it is the story of the North itself. For without them, there would be no sagas, no kings, no heroes, only silence where once there was life. Their legacy is every breath that followed, every story told, every name carried forward. They were the unseen warriors, the true bearers of fate, and their strength remains etched into the bones of history.